Hey, welcome back. And if this is your very first time here, I am genuinely glad you found this place. Tonight we're going to travel back 500 years to a world that on the surface looked nothing like ours, but underneath, in the most human ways possible, had everything to do with who we are today. Here is something that will stop you cold if you really sit with it. In the year 1500, roughly 90% of all people in Europe, 9 out of every 10 human beings walking the earth at that time, woke up every single morning not knowing with certainty whether they would eat that day. Not whether they would eat well, whether they would eat at all. And across town, sometimes literally across the same town, separated by one stone wall, the other 10% were sleeping in beds warmed by servants who'd been awake since before sunrise, tending to fires, preparing food, laying out the clothes of people they would never in this life or the next be allowed to sit beside at dinner. Same world, same sky, completely different planets, and tonight we're going to spend time in both of those worlds, not to judge, not to recite facts at you like a textbook, but to really feel what it was like, what you would have smelled, tasted, feared and hoped for, depending entirely on which side of that wall you happen to be born on. Because the past is not just a collection of dates and names, it is a mirror, and sometimes when you look closely enough, the reflection looking back is uncomfortably familiar. So settle in. We're going to the year 1500. Let us start with a big picture, because you need to understand the map before you can walk through the territory. Europe in 1500 was not one place. It was a patchwork, hundreds of kingdoms, city-states, dukedoms, each with its own language, its own laws, its own version of who mattered and who did not. But despite all those differences, almost every corner of Europe ran on the same invisible engine. And that engine had a name: the Three Estates. The French thinker Charles de Loiseau, writing at the tail end of this era, described it plainly. Society was divided into 3 groups: the clergy, whose job was to pray for everyone's souls; the nobility, whose job was to protect everyone from violence; and then everyone else, the Third Estate, the farmers, craftsmen, merchants, whose job was to work and produce everything the other 2 groups needed to survive. It sounds almost reasonable when you phrase it like that, almost like a fair trade. Except it was not, because that Third Estate, the ones doing all the actual work, they made up somewhere between 85 and 90% of the entire population. 90% of the people, carrying 100% of the labour and getting the smallest share of what they produced. Now I want to be careful here, because history is almost never as clean as a pie chart makes it look. The world in 1500 was not simply rich versus poor, the way we might imagine it, like 2 teams facing off across a field. The reality was much messier, and honestly much more interesting. Within the nobility itself there were enormous variations. At the very top, great lords, dukes, counts, princes owned vast estates and commanded armies. But here is something most people do not realize. According to historical records, roughly 3/4 of Europe's nobility was not wealthy at all. Many minor nobles, what the French called petits nobles, and what the Spanish called hidalgos, owned perhaps a single small village. Some barely owned a farm's worth of land. In Poland and Hungary, historians have documented cases where successful peasant farmers actually enjoyed a higher standard of living than these impoverished petty nobles living right next door. Think about that for a moment. A dirt farmer by sheer hard work and a little luck living better than someone with a noble title. History is full of those kinds of surprises, and within the peasantry too there were huge differences. A free peasant who owned his own small plot of land, what the English called a yeoman farmer, lived a life categorically different from a serf who was legally bound to his lord's land. A serf could not marry without his lord's permission. He could not move to another village without permission. In the most extreme cases, particularly in Eastern Europe, serfs could be bought and sold along with the land itself, a condition that historians describe plainly as a form of slavery. So when we talk about the poor of 1500 Europe, we're talking about an enormous and varied group bound together not by any single shared experience, but by a shared condition powerlessness. Almost no control over where they lived, how they worked, what they earned, or what future their children would have. Now let us talk about numbers for a moment, because numbers have a way of making abstract things feel real. Europe's total population around 1500 was somewhere between 60 and 70 million people. After the catastrophic losses of the Black Death, which had swept through in waves since the 1300s, the continent was still recovering. Cities were growing again. Trade was expanding. There was a fragile but real sense that things might be getting better. But for most people, better meant something very modest. It meant that you might eat bread every day instead of just on lucky days, that your children might survive infancy, though even that was far from guaranteed, with childhood mortality rates staggeringly high by any modern measure. The nobility that top 1 to 2% in Western Europe, rising to as much as 10% in places like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, controlled the majority of all productive land. Historical records consistently show noble families owning well over half of all arable land on the continent, while representing a tiny fraction of those who lived on it. And here is the part that I think cuts to the heart of why this history matters. The wealth was not just about land or money, it was about time. A wealthy lord and aristocratic family, they had time. Time to read, to debate, to travel, to commission art, to plan for tomorrow and next year and the decade after that. Their days were not consumed by the relentless physical labour of survival. A peasant, even a relatively successful one, had almost no spare time. From the moment the light came up until it faded, life was work, and not work in the sense we complain about on a Monday morning. Work that if you stopped for too long meant your children went without. There are contemporary accounts from this period describing peasant men in their 40s routinely being mistaken for men in their 60s. The physical toll was simply written on their bodies, and the wealthy court portraits from this exact era, 1500 to 1520, show lords and ladies with soft hands, clear complexions, and what one historian described as a kind of effortless physical ease that was itself a form of status display. Their bodies, in a very literal sense, advertised their privilege. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated, and I think this is the part most history books rush past. In 1500, poverty was not seen as a failure or an accident. It was seen as the natural order of things, divinely ordained. The Catholic Church, which held enormous influence over how ordinary people understood their world, taught explicitly that social hierarchy was God's design. The rich were rich because God had placed them there. The poor were poor for the same reason. To question that order was not just politically dangerous, it was technically a form of heresy. And what is remarkable is that most people believed this. Not because they were foolish, they were not, but because they had no framework for imagining anything different. This is something I find genuinely moving when I study this period. When you look at the surviving accounts from poor peasants, the letters, the wills, the court testimonies, you do not find people consumed by rage. You find people trying with real dignity to make meaning within the circumstances they were born into. The historian's phrase for it is the art of the possible. They could not change the system, but within the system they found love, community, celebration, and moments of genuine joy. That is not nothing, that is actually everything. Now here is the twist I want you to hold in your mind as we move forward. 1500 was not a frozen moment. It was a hinge point. The year 1517, just 17 years ahead, From where we are standing right now, Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg and crack the religious order of Europe wide open. The year 1525, the German peasants' revolt would see hundreds of thousands of common people take up arms against the very social order we've been describing. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg just a few decades before, was already spreading ideas at a speed the world had never seen. Ideas that threatened the neat, tidy pyramid of estates that everyone had been told was permanent and God-given. The world of 1,500 of lords and serfs of stone castles and earthen floors was, without knowing it, living on borrowed time. We have laid the foundation tonight. We know who populated this world, what they were called, and the invisible rules that governed every single thing about their lives. In what comes next, we're going inside those lives, into the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the homes they slept in, and the bodies they lived in from birth to death. Because that is what these people deserve, the ones who built the world we inherited. The real story of 1500 is not just the kings in their palaces. It is the person who built the palace, carried the stone, mixed the mortar, and then went home to a one-room house and made dinner over an open fire. That person deserves to be known, and that story is just getting started. Let me start with a doctor's warning from 1585 that sounds completely insane to modern ears. Dr. Baldassare Pisanelli of Bologna, a respected physician of his time, wrote the following medical advice. The rich man's proper diet will sicken the poor man just as quickly as the poor man's diet will cripple the noble. When peasants dine on birds, they get sick. He was not joking. He genuinely believed, as did most educated people of his era, that peasants and nobles had different physiologies, that their bodies were fundamentally different machines requiring different fuel. The logic went like this. Food that grows close to the ground belongs to people who work close to the ground. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots were peasant food. But food that grows high fruit from trees, birds from the sky, meat from tall animals like deer or cattle, that food was suited to people of elevated status. This was not just superstition. This was medicine, written down, taught, believed. And what is remarkable about this is not that it was wrong, though it was spectacularly embarrassingly wrong, but that it reveals something deeper about how people in 1500 understood the world. They truly believed that social hierarchy was built into the very structure of nature. That inequality was not just a political system, it was biology. Food in 1500 was never just food. It was a statement about who you were, where you belonged, and whether you mattered. So let us talk about what people actually ate. Starting as we must with the thing that almost everyone ate every single day: bread. Bread was the foundation of the medieval and Renaissance diet for both rich and poor. But, and this is crucial, not all bread was created equal. The bread a peasant ate was dark, heavy, and coarse. It was made from whatever grain was cheapest and most available in the region. Barley, rye, sometimes oats, occasionally mixed with ground peas or beans to stretch it further. This bread was dense, chewy. It filled you up, but it was not exactly a pleasure to eat. It was fuel. The bread a wealthy person ate was a completely different substance. It was white, light, made from finely milled wheat flour that had been sifted multiple times to remove all the bran and texture. This bread was soft, delicate, sometimes even sweet. It was called manche in England or pain de bouche in France, bread for the mouth, not just the stomach. The difference was not subtle. If you placed the two loaves side by side, you would think they came from different planets. And here is the thing, the peasant's bread was actually more nutritious. It had fibre, it had minerals, but nutrition was not the point. The point was status. The whitest, lightest, most refined bread was the most desirable, because it required the most labour, the most processing, the most expense. It was a visible, edible proof of wealth. The hierarchy of bread was so important that sumptuary laws designed to keep social classes visibly separate sometimes regulated what kind of bread people were allowed to eat. Not because anyone thought peasants would rise up if they tasted white bread, but because allowing a merchant to eat like a noble blurred the lines that everyone desperately wanted to keep sharp. Now let us move from bread to the thing that defined the real gap between rich and poor meat. For a peasant, meat was rare, astonishingly rare. The average peasant family might eat meat a handful of times a year at major religious festivals like Easter or Christmas, at a wedding maybe after a successful harvest if the Lord was feeling generous. The rest of the time their diet was grains, vegetables, a bit of cheese if they were lucky, and whatever they could forage. Part of the reason meat was so rare was salt. Salt was the only way to preserve meat in this era, and salt was expensive. Unbelievably expensive. For a peasant living inland far from the coast, salt might cost more than they could reasonably afford. So even if they had a pig, and many peasant families did keep a pig, they often could not preserve the meat for long-term storage. The pig might be slaughtered in late autumn, and the family would have a brief window of fresh pork before it spoiled. But for the nobility, meat was everywhere. Every day, multiple times a day. At a noble banquet you might see roasted venison, wild boar, swan, peacock, beef, mutton, rabbit, and half a dozen kinds of birds all on the same table. And the presentation was theatrical. Renaissance banquets were not just meals, they were performances. A roasted peacock would be served with its feathers sewn back on so it looked alive. Swans were gilded with gold leaf. There are records of banquets where a pie was cut open and live birds flew out purely for the spectacle. One cookbook from 1420, written by Master Chiquart the chef to the Duke of Savoy, contains instructions for preparing a 2-day feast. Chiquart recommends having on hand at least 1,000 cartloads of good dry firewood and a barnful of coal just to keep the kitchens running. The scale was staggering. Bartolomeo Scappi, who was chef to Pope Pius V in the mid-1500s, left behind a cookbook with over 1,000 recipes. Some papal banquets reportedly served up to 1,000 dishes over the course of an evening. Not 1,000 servings. 1,000 different dishes. Most guests would never even see half of them. The rarest and most exotic dishes were reserved for the most important people at the head table. But here is where it gets strange, and I think genuinely fascinating. The Church required that all Christians, rich and poor alike, abstain from meat for roughly 1/3 of the year, every Friday, every Wednesday in some regions, the entire 40 days of Lent, all the vigils before major holy days. On those days, eating meat was a sin. And people took this seriously. Kings and peasants alike complained bitterly about fasting, but they did it. The historical record is full of grumbling. One chronicler notes that during Lent, kings and schoolboys, commoners and nobility all complained about being deprived of meat for the long hard weeks of solemn contemplation of their sins. But, and this is the twist, the nobility found ways around it that the poor simply did not have access to. On fish days the wealthy ate spectacularly. Salmon, trout, eel, sturgeon, oysters, lobsters, crabs. Imported delicacies from across Europe, and they served what food historians call illusion foods, dishes designed to look like meat, but technically made from fish or almonds, fish moulded to look like venison. Fake eggs made by stuffing empty eggshells with fish roe and almond milk and cooking them in coals. The poor, meanwhile, ate whatever fish they could catch or afford. Salted herring mostly, cheap, plentiful, and after a few weeks of Lent, utterly monotonous. So even in fasting, even in the practice that was supposed to level everyone before God wealth created a completely different experience, there is one more layer to this that I want to touch on because I think it captures something essential about how food and class intersected in 1500. Vegetables. Most Renaissance cookbooks contain almost no vegetable recipes, and when vegetables do appear, they are high vegetables, leafy greens like spinach or charred artichokes, things that grow upward and outward. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets barely get mentioned. This was not because nobles did not eat vegetables. They did. But vegetables were considered so basic, so fundamental, that they did not need to be written down. Cookbooks were for showing off, for recording the elaborate, the expensive, the impressive, and ironically this meant that the peasant diet heavy in root vegetables, beans and legumes was probably healthier in many ways than the noble diet, which was shockingly heavy in meat, fat and sugar. Medical texts from the 1500s actually warned against eating too many raw vegetables, because physicians thought they caused evil humours or indigestion. Rich people who had access to endless meat ate very few vegetables. Poor people who ate vegetables because they had no choice accidentally had a more balanced diet. The people with the most food choices often made the worst nutritional decisions, and the people with no choices at all sometimes ended up healthier. That paradox would have been completely invisible to anyone living through it. I want to end with a moment that I think captures the emotional weight of all of this. Imagine being a peasant child in 1500. Imagine that for most of your life you've eaten bread porridge, a bit of cheese, turnips, onions, and on very special occasions a piece of salted fish. And then one day, maybe at a wedding, maybe at a harvest festival, you taste roasted meat for the first time. The flavour, the richness, the fat, the salt, the way it fills your mouth with something you have never experienced before, and then you go back to your normal life, back to porridge, back to bread. Knowing that the people in the manor house just a few miles away eat that kind of food every single day, multiple times a day, as much as they want. How do you hold both of those realities in your mind at the same time? I do not think most peasants walked around seething with resentment. The evidence does not suggest that, but I do think there was an awareness, a knowledge, a sense that the world was profoundly unequal, and that this inequality was woven into everything, including the most basic act of eating. Food in 1500 was a language. It told you where you stood. It reminded you 3 times a day of your place in the order of things. The nobleman ate birds because he was elevated. The peasant ate roots because he was low. And both of them believed, or were told to believe, that this was the natural order, that God had designed it this way, that to want anything different was not just impractical, it was heretical. But belief systems, no matter how total they seem, are never quite as solid as they appear, and the cracks were already forming. In the next part of our story, we're leaving the table and walking through the door. Because the gap between rich and poor was not just visible in what people ate, it was visible in where they slept, how they stayed warm, and whether they had a single moment of privacy in their entire lives. The houses of 1500 tell a story that is in some ways even more stark than the food. Let us go inside. Picture this for a moment. It is a January night in the year 1510. Somewhere in northern France the temperature has dropped to well below freezing. The wind is coming in sideways, and 2 families, both living within a few miles of each other, are about to spend that night in conditions so different from one another that you almost cannot believe they exist on the same continent. One family's going to sleep in a room with walls thick enough to keep out a siege, a bed piled so high with goose-down mattresses that you have to climb 4 wooden steps just to get into it, and heavy velvet curtains drawn all the way around to hold in the warmth. The other family is going to sleep on a dirt floor on a thin mat of woven straw pressed together in the dark with their children, and depending on how cold the night gets, possibly also their pig. I am not exaggerating. That is not a metaphor. And here is the thing that I find most fascinating about the history of homes in 1500 Europe. It is not just that the houses looked different on the outside. It is that the very concept of home, what a home was, for what it meant, what it was supposed to feel like, was entirely different depending on which side of that gap you were born on. So let us walk through both doors tonight. Start with the peasant cottage because that is where the vast majority of people lived. The typical peasant dwelling in early 16th century Europe was by almost every modern standard extraordinarily small. Historical sources and archaeological evidence consistently describe these homes as measuring somewhere between 15 and 30 feet in length, roughly the size of a modern two-car garage. That single main room did everything. Cooking happened there, eating happened there, working happened there, and at night sleeping happened there for the entire family together with no separation, no privacy, no difference between the room where you lived and the room where you rested. Think about that. There was no going to bed. There was just the room shifting after sunset from the place where you lived to the place where you slept. Same walls, same smoke-darkened ceiling, same floor, and the floor itself tells you so much. In most peasant homes of this period, the floor was packed earth-hard, dark, cold earth, covered with a layer of fresh straw or rushes for a little insulation. But these layers were rarely changed often enough. Historical accounts from this era describe floors where the straw had accumulated so long that if you looked closely you could find old food scraps, small bones, the remnants of things spilled and forgotten, and quite regularly fleas. Fleas were not only a problem for the poor, even the wealthiest households in 1500 Europe dealt with them. But in a one-room peasant cottage with a dirt floor, straw bedding, and animals sharing the space in winter, they were an unavoidable fact of life. The walls of these homes were typically built using wattle and daub interwoven wooden sticks packed with clay straw, and sometimes animal dung then smoothed over and whitewashed. It was practical, surprisingly effective. But it was not airtight. Cold found its way through. And because windows were just wooden shutters with no glass, the choice on a winter night was bleak. Open the shutters and let in the cold, or close them and breathe the smoke from the central fire. That fire sat in a pit in the middle of the floor, with a hole cut in the thatch roof above for the smoke to escape in theory. In practice, the smoke did what it wanted and spent a fair amount of time filling the room first. Historians who have studied cause of death records from this period note that respiratory problems were staggeringly common among people who spent their lives in these interiors. You did not just live with the fire, you breathed it day and night for your entire life, and the bed. Most peasants did not have one, not in any way we would recognize the word. The very poor slept on loose straw on the floor, possibly covered by a rough woolen blanket. Slightly better off families might have a straw pallet, a cloth sack stuffed with hay or moss laid on the ground. One historical inventory from this period lists a peasant's sleeping arrangements as 3 boards for a bed, 3 planks of wood arranged on the floor topped with a piece of cloth. That was an improvement. That was something to aspire to. Do you ever take your mattress for granted? I think about that sometimes. Now let us cross the wall. A wealthy nobleman's home in 1500 Europe was a different universe, and not just because it was larger. The difference was architectural, psychological, and almost philosophical. The most important room in a noble household was the Great Hall. It was enormous by the standards of the day, sometimes 30, 40, 60 feet long, with stone walls, high ceilings, and a massive fireplace along one wall that could burn logs as thick as a man's torso. This was not a private room. It was a public space, a place to receive guests, conduct business, dine with the household and display power. Even the design of the room was a kind of performance. But the truly remarkable space, the one that tells you the most about what wealth meant in 1500, was the solar. The solar was essentially the Lord's private retreat, an upper floor room accessed through a small passage at the high end of the great hall. It was where the noble family slept, received intimate guests, and crucially had something the peasant cottage could not offer at any price: privacy. And in the solar there was the bed. The great bed of a wealthy nobleman in this period was not furniture. It was a statement. It was a monument. Historical records from Warwick Castle, dated around the year 1400, describe a bed made of red damask embroidered with ostrich feathers, complete with a tester and canopy, 3 matching curtains of fine fabric, and 18 coordinating tapestries hung around the room. Moving King James V of Scotland's Great Green Bed, just 20 miles from Falkland Palace to St Andrews in the year 1539, cost what would amount to more than $100,000 in today's money. According to records from the National Trust for Scotland, a bed was not just somewhere you slept, it was possibly your most valuable possession. The construction of these noble beds was itself a feat of engineering. The wooden frame was strung with ropes woven back and forth, the forerunner of what we now call a box spring, and on top of that base came not one mattress but several in layers. First a rough straw mattress, then a wool mattress above it, then for the truly wealthy a feather bed on top, stuffed with goose, down so fine and so deep that it reportedly felt like sinking into a warm cloud. Linen sheets, wool blankets, fur coverlets from animals that most common people had never seen, and then the whole structure wrapped in heavy curtains on all 4 sides, creating a small heated room within a room. There is something genuinely sensuous about the way historical accounts describe these beds. Writers of the period called them nests and havens. And considering that the alternative was a dirt floor and a straw mat, I think that language is completely earned. But here is where the story gets interesting, and this is the part I genuinely did not expect when I first started researching this topic. Privacy, even for the wealthy, was not what we imagine it was. Even in a grand castle, even in a richly appointed solar, a nobleman rarely slept alone. His personal servant, sometimes called a body servant, slept in the same room on a small pallet on the floor. Important guests might be invited to share the actual bed itself, which was considered a mark of great honour. And throughout the castle, the dozens of household staff, knights and courtiers who made up a great lord's retinue were distributed through various rooms and halls according to rank. The great hall itself, after the evening meal was cleared, became a sleeping space for the lower servants and lesser members of the household. They would unroll their straw pallets onto the floor, the same floor where they had just been serving dinner, and sleep in rows side by side, the flickering embers of the great fireplace providing the only warmth. So the famous 4-poster bed with its drawn curtains was not just about comfort. It was about creating a bubble of privacy inside a world that had almost none. There is a historian named Sarah McKinnon who spent years studying medieval manuscript illuminations, paintings in old books that show us what peasant homes actually looked like from the inside out. She made a point that has stayed with me. Looking at later 15th century manuscripts, she observed that some peasant homes depicted were surprisingly solid and well built, with leaded glass windows and proper roofs. Her conclusion was quietly radical. She wrote that these images suggest a measure of material well-being and economic prosperity had been attained by at least some members of peasant society. Not all peasants lived in squalor. Some had achieved a genuinely decent standard of living even within the constraints of their social position. History is never as simple as the worst examples suggest. And yet, when you stand back and look at the full picture, the smoke-filled one-room cottages on one side and the curtained, fur-covered layered beds on the other, the gap is staggering. Not just in comfort, but in what each space said about your worth as a human being. The peasant's home said you exist to work. You sleep where you work. You rest only as much as necessary to start again. The nobleman's home said your comfort matters. Your privacy matters. Your sleep is precious enough to be protected by curtains and servants and layers of feather down. That is not just a difference in architecture. That is a difference in identity. And here is what I keep returning to in 1500, the idea that every person deserved a space of their own, a room of one's own, would have been considered not just impractical but genuinely revolutionary. Space was something you earned through birth, or not at all. Today we take it for granted that a home should feel like yours, that your bedroom should be your retreat, that you deserve a door you can close. Those are not ancient ideas. In the full sweep of history, they are astonishingly new. We have been inside the homes now, felt the cold draft through the wattle walls and the warmth of the feather bed behind its curtains. But a home is more than walls and a roof. It is what you wear when you walk out the door and what your clothes said to the world and to yourself about exactly who you were. That story, and it is a surprisingly rich one, is where we are headed next. Clothing in the year 1500 was not fashion. We use that word now, fashion, and it carries a certain lightness to it. Trends, seasons, self-expression. The idea that what you wear today says something about your personality, your taste, your mood. But 500 years ago, what you wore did not express your personality. It declared your rank. And in most of Europe, the government was legally involved in making sure you got it right. There was a system of laws, and I want you to sit with this for a second because it is one of those historical facts that sounds made up but is absolutely real. A system of laws called sumptuary laws, which quite literally dictated by your social class what fabrics you were allowed to wear. Not just what you could afford, what you were legally permitted to put on your body. Purple silk reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Velvet only for those of a certain rank and above. Fur trimming from ermine, the white fur with black tips that you still see on royal robes today. Strictly controlled by birth. In England, between the years 1300 and 1500, lawmakers passed dozens of separate sumptuary statutes. Dozens. The fact that they needed so many rewrites and updates tells you something interesting all by itself. People kept breaking the rules. Because of course they did. When you tell people they cannot wear something, you make it irresistible. The French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, writing in the 1570s when these laws were still very much in force, put it brilliantly. He wrote that to forbid the wearing of velvet and gold lace to the common people was to bring them into a greater esteem and to set everyone more agog to wear them. In other words, the harder you try to fence off luxury, the more everyone wants to climb that fence. But the fact that people bent the rules does not mean the rules were not real. They were, and for most people the rules were simply the shape of the world. So let us start where clothing always starts, with the fabric itself. In 1500, every piece of cloth was made by hand. Every thread was spun by hand. Every yard of fabric was woven on a loom, operated by a skilled craftsperson who had spent years learning the trade. There were no factories, no machines, no cheap synthetic alternatives, and the result of that was a world in which fabric, plain simple fabric, was one of the most valuable commodities on earth. For the poor, the available fabrics were wool and linen. That was essentially the full menu. Wool was the great workhorse of medieval and Renaissance textile life. It came in many qualities, from rough and scratchy at the bottom to surprisingly fine at the top, but what the average peasant wore was the coarser end of the spectrum. Wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool hose that tied at the waist. These garments were durable, which was important because they had to last, and they were warm, which was critical in the drafty, unheated environments where most people lived and worked. Linen made from the flax plant was the other staple used primarily for the layers closest to the body. The undershift, the braize, the chemise beneath the outer wool garments. This was the layer you actually washed with any regularity because wool, when submerged in hot soapy water, has a tendency to shrink felt and essentially destroy itself. People in 1500 Europe understood this perfectly. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, wear a soft washable linen layer right against your skin so the outer wool garments never need to touch your body directly. The linen absorbs the sweat and oils. The wool stays clean enough without being washed. This system, by the way, worked so well that it persisted essentially unchanged in European clothing for the next 400 years. Every historical undergarment you've ever seen in a period costume covering far more of the body than any modern undergarment is solving exactly this problem. Now here is something that I find genuinely startling when I sit down with the numbers. A peasant in 1500 Europe typically owned somewhere between 2 and 4 complete outfits. Total, in an entire lifetime. That was it. 2 of each undergarment, 1 main outer garment, a hat, a belt and shoes. According to historical accounts from this period, a person often had only a single article of clothing to wear, while the rest were being washed, which, given how labour-intensive washing was, might happen only every few weeks, or even months. Think about that the next time you stand in front of a full closet and complain you have nothing to wear. The colours of peasant clothing were muted to the point of near invisibility. Browns, greys, undyed creamy whites, dirty ochres. Not because people had no aesthetic sense, they absolutely did, but because genuine colour required dye, and dye required money. Plant-based dyes could produce some colour, but they faded in the sun and rain within a season. Only the richest could afford to re-dye their clothing. So even if you started the year with a garment of respectable colour by midsummer, it had typically faded into something closer to a memory of colour. There is something quietly melancholy about that image. Clothing that wore its own poverty right there in the fading of the fabric. Now step into the wardrobe of a wealthy nobleman or noblewoman of 1500, and you are entering a completely different world. Not just different in quality, different in kind. The great luxury fabric of the Renaissance was silk, imported from Asia via the Silk Road, processed in the great textile cities of northern Italy, like Florence, Lucca and Venice, and sold across Europe at prices that put it beyond the reach of all but the very top of the social pyramid. Silk was not merely beautiful, it was geographically improbable. The fact that it came from the other side of the known world, passed through dozens of hands, survived months of travel, and ended up draping the shoulders of a duke in Lyon or a duchess in London, that distance itself was part of what you were buying. Then there was velvet, a fabric made by weaving 2 layers of silk simultaneously, and then cutting them apart, creating that deep, light-catching pile. To produce even a single yard of velvet required extraordinary skill and expensive equipment. A single gown of Venetian velvet in the early 1500s could cost the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman earned in an entire year. And then dye. The colours available to the wealthy were colours that the poor could not access even in imitation. Deep scarlet red, produced from the dried bodies of an insect called kermes, was extraordinarily expensive. True purple, associated with royalty since ancient times, was reserved by law and price for the very highest tier of society. Rich blue, made from woad, or the more expensive imported indigo, signalled wealth on sight. One sleeve, a single detachable sleeve, which was fashionable among the Italian nobility of this period, given to Bona of Savoy by Ludovico the Moor, was decorated with a phoenix motif in diamonds and pearls. The documented value of that one sleeve alone was 18,000 ducats. To give you some scale, a skilled Florentine artisan at the time earned roughly 50 to 100 ducats per year. One sleeve, 18,000 ducats. But here is the piece of the clothing story that I find most revealing, most psychologically interesting, and most surprisingly modern in its implications. In 1500, Europe, your clothing did not just communicate your wealth. It actively produced your social reality. Let me explain what I mean by that. When a nobleman walked through a marketplace dressed in velvet and scarlet, people around him physically moved out of his way. They bowed. They averted their eyes. They did not speak to him unless spoken to. His clothing was in a very practical sense a technology of social control. It communicated power before he opened his mouth. And when a peasant walked into the same marketplace, the reverse was true. The rough wool, the faded colour, the worn leather shoes, these things told everyone nearby this person has no power. This person can be ignored, interrupted, overcharged, pushed aside. The sumptuary laws were not just about restricting access to luxury. They were about maintaining the legibility of social hierarchy. They were about making sure that at a glance from a distance, without a word being spoken, everyone could read the room. And what happens when that system breaks down, when a merchant who has made a fortune in trade can afford silk, but the law says he cannot wear it? You get fraud. You get creative workarounds. You get the rich merchant's wife wearing velvet, just to church, and claiming it is borrowed. You get the minor nobleman who can barely pay his debts, but refuses to dress in anything less than what his title demands, because in this world the clothes are the title. In Siena, the city actually employed officials, essentially a fashion police, and I cannot say those words without finding them at least a little bit funny, whose specific job was to wander through public spaces and catch people wearing prohibited items. Reports from the 1440s describe state officials catching offenders at taverns, market squares, and the entrance of the cathedral physically tearing unauthorized jewelry from their necks and arms on the spot. That is not a metaphor. They were literally ripping accessories off people in the street. And now here is the question I want to leave you with, because I think it is worth carrying forward. We like to think we have moved past all of this. That modern fashion is different, freer, more democratic, more about personal expression than social performance. But is it entirely? Think about how quickly you size someone up based on what they are wearing, not consciously, automatically. In a fraction of a second, you are already drawing conclusions about someone's income, their education, their background, the kind of person they are. The algorithm runs instantly below the level of deliberate thought. In 1500, that algorithm was legally enforced and physically obvious. Today, it runs quietly and visibly in the back of every mind in every room. The medium has changed. The message has not changed quite as much as we might like to think. We have walked through the homes, the kitchens, the wardrobes. We have seen how the world looked from the outside, what people ate, where they slept, what they wore. But here is what we have not yet touched, and it might be the most personal, the most intimate, the most viscerally human part of this entire story. What happened when they got sick? What did it feel like to be a sick person in 1500, or just as importantly, to be a well one, to have access to medicine and care, or to have none at all? Because in 1500 your body was arguably the place where the gap between rich and poor was felt most completely. And what those two worlds looked like from the inside of a body trying to survive is where we are going next. There is a number that has stayed with me ever since I first came across it. and I want to give it to you right at the start because I think it sets the scene better than any description I could write. In the year 1500, roughly 1 in 3 children born in Europe did not live to see their 16th birthday. 1 in 3. That was not a tragedy in 1500. That was simply the texture of life, the baseline against which everything else was measured. Every parent who had a child knew with the kind of quiet knowledge that you carry in your chest rather than your head that some of their children would not make it to adulthood, not because they had done something wrong, not because they had failed, just because that was the world. And here is the question I want to sit with tonight. Was that number the same for a peasant family in a one-room cottage, and for a noble family in a stone manor house? The answer, as it turns out, is more complicated and more surprising than you might expect. And in that complexity there is one of the most genuinely revealing windows into what it actually meant to be rich or poor in 1500 Europe. Let us start with something that surprises almost everyone when they first encounter it. Being wealthy in 1500 did not necessarily mean you were healthier. In some ways, and this sounds almost impossible until you look at the evidence, it could make you less healthy. Consider how the wealthy were treated when they fell ill. If you were a person of means in 1500 Europe, you had access to a university-trained physician. This was considered the pinnacle of medical care. These were men who had studied for years at institutions like Bologna, Paris, or Oxford, steeped in the ancient theories of Hippocrates and Galen, who taught that the human body contained 4 fluids. They called them humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When you fell ill, the theory went one of these humours had fallen out of balance, and the cure was to restore that balance. In practice, this meant the physician would examine your urine, holding the flask up to the light with great ceremony and gravitas. Take your pulse, ask about your temperament, and then prescribe one of a handful of treatments that were essentially variations on the same theme: remove something from your body. Bloodletting was by far the most common. The physician, or more often the barber surgeon he employed to do the hands-on work, would open a vein, typically in the arm, and drain blood until the patient looked appropriately pale and weakened. This was considered therapeutic. In patients who were already feverish, already dehydrated, already fighting off infection, the removal of significant quantities of blood did exactly what you would expect it to do. It made them weaker. Then there was induced vomiting, and induced sweating, and various foul-smelling poultices applied to the skin to draw out corruption, and the occasional prescription of medicines compounded from substances that included, depending on the practitioner, mercury, antimony, and in some cases the dried and powdered bodies of insects. One historian noted, and I have always appreciated this observation for its dry wit, that it is entirely possible that the peasant with his magic stones and herbal drinks was more likely to recover from illness than the rich man who could afford the physician. Now, I want to be fair. These physicians were not fools. They were working with the best knowledge available to them, inherited from centuries of tradition, and within that framework their treatments had an internal logic. But from a modern standpoint, the wealthy patient who summoned his physician was in a real and measurable sense in danger from the treatment as much as from the disease. For the poor, the story was entirely different, not necessarily better in outcome, but different in nature. Most ordinary people in 1500 Europe never saw a physician in their lives. Physicians were expensive, rare, and mostly urban. In the countryside, where the majority of the population lived, if you were sick, you turned to one of 2 sources: the local wise woman or wise man who knew the herbs and had learned their craft through generations of passed down practical knowledge, or the monastery where monks and nuns ran what passed for hospitals, providing basic care and a place to lie down, though not much more. The herbal knowledge of village healers was in many cases genuinely effective. willow bark, which contains the compound salicin, the precursor to modern aspirin, was used for pain and fever. Honey was applied to wounds as an antiseptic, and it genuinely works because honey has real antibacterial properties. Yarrow was used to slow bleeding from cuts. Many of the treatments that humble healers passed down through oral tradition had real pharmacological action, even if the theory behind them was wrapped in superstition and prayer. But for serious illness, for fever that would not break, for infections that spread, for the catastrophic diseases that swept through communities, herbal remedies and prayers were not enough, and the poor had nothing else. Here is what I find genuinely striking about this. When serious disease came, it did not distinguish between the peasant's cottage and the nobleman's manor. The bubonic plague, still recurring in waves across Europe through the 1500s, killed rich and poor with terrible even-handedness. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. Dukes, cardinals, peasants, all of them equally helpless before a disease no one understood and no one could stop. Smallpox made no class distinctions. Syphilis, which arrived in Europe from the Americas in the late 1400s and spread with terrifying speed, was no respecter of titles. Dysentery, the disease that killed more soldiers than battles ever did, struck noble and common alike whenever water became contaminated. So here is the paradox I keep returning to. The wealth divide in health was real, but it was not simple. Not. The wealthy had physicians who sometimes hurt as much as they helped. The poor had folk healers who sometimes helped more than we give them credit for. And when the great epidemics swept through, all of those distinctions collapsed entirely. But there is one area where the gap between rich and poor in health is unambiguous and heartbreaking, and that is in the very earliest years of life. That 1 in 3 figure, 1 in 3 children not reaching their 16th birthday, was not evenly distributed across the social scale. For children of peasants, the rate was significantly worse. Malnutrition in the first years of life, contaminated water, no way to isolate a sick child from the rest of a family crowded into one room, no ability to maintain warmth or cleanliness when illness struck, a simple cut that got infected, a respiratory illness that in a well-nourished warm child would pass in a week, but in a malnourished cold exhausted child could spiral into something fatal. Historical data from England shows that the children of the highest nobility, once they survived past age 5, had measurably lower mortality rates than children of the general population through adolescence, not because they had better medicine, but because they had consistent food warmth and protection from the worst of the elements. And there was one advantage the wealthy had that was in epidemic times absolutely decisive: they could leave. When plague struck a city, a wealthy family could load a wagon and retreat to a country estate, putting miles between themselves and the outbreak. The poor could not. They were bound to their work, their village, their fields. They had to stay. They had to watch it come. This is one of those historical realities that once you fully see it, sits with you differently. Throughout most of human history, the single most powerful predictor of whether your children lived or died was not how much you loved them. It was how much money you had. Pause and sit with that for a moment. And then there is the matter of how people understood illness itself, because the ideas behind medicine are just as revealing as the treatments. In 1500, there was no germ theory, no understanding that diseases were caused by bacteria or viruses. The closest anyone came to an intuition of contagion was the observation made by a handful of thoughtful physicians that illness seemed to spread from person to person. The Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, writing in the 1530s, proposed something remarkable for his time: that epidemics might be caused by tiny particles invisible to the eye that pass between people through direct contact through the air, or even through objects like clothing. He called these particles seeds of disease. He was describing 3 centuries before anyone could prove it what we now call pathogens. But Fracastoro was a rare outlier. For most people, illness was understood as either divine punishment or a disruption of natural forces in the body. Neither framework led naturally to the idea of quarantine sanitation or any of the public health measures that would eventually change everything. In cities especially, the conditions were extraordinary. Open gutters ran through streets. Waste from humans and animals accumulated in ways that when rain fell, sent contaminated water flowing into wells. Rats and fleas moved freely through homes and granaries. The rich had stone floors and could maintain somewhat cleaner living conditions, but they breathed the same city air. They drank from the same water sources. They walked the same streets. That barber surgeon pole, the red and white striped pole you may still see outside old-fashioned barbershops today, is a relic of this exact period. The red stripe represented blood from operations. The white stripe represented the bandages. It was once the symbol of the man who pulled your teeth in the market square, opened your veins to balance your humours, and set your broken bones with instruments that had not been cleaned since the last patient. History has a way of leaving its marks in surprisingly everyday places. When I step back from everything we have covered tonight, the physicians and the wise women, the humours and the herbs, the plague and the privilege, what strikes me most is not the suffering. It is the resilience. People in 1500 knew in a way that very few of us have to know today that the body was fragile, that illness could come for anyone, that death did not wait patiently at the end of a long life. It came in the middle of things, suddenly, without explanation, that fully satisfied, and yet they kept going. They built families, they tended their fields, they made bread and told stories and fell in love. Not in spite of that fragility, but somehow alongside it, living fully inside a world that offered no guarantee of tomorrow. There is something about that which I find genuinely humbling, something that makes the ordinary anxieties of modern life feel, if I am honest, a little smaller. We have now looked at the body when it was sick, but there is a dimension of physical existence in 1500 we've not yet explored, one that is in some ways even more fundamental. How did people actually spend their days? What did the rhythm of work look like hour by hour, season by season? What was the difference between a life measured entirely in labour and a life that had something else in it? Because in 1500, work was not just what you did to earn your living. For the vast majority of people, it was the entire content of their days from the moment light came up to the moment it faded. And the contrast between how differently that weight landed on rich and poor is one of the most visceral things we have yet to explore. That is exactly where we are headed next. What if I told you that a peasant farmer in 15th century England, someone who slept on a straw pallet, owned 2 shirts, and had never once in his life tasted sugar, may have worked fewer hours in a year than you do? I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because the numbers are actually there, and they come from a very unexpected place. In 1991, Harvard economist Juliet Shaw published a book called The Overworked American, in which she went back through centuries of labor records to ask a deceptively simple question: when did people start working this much? What she found when she looked at the wage records and estate accounts of medieval England was that a typical adult male peasant worked approximately 1,620 hours per year, by her estimates that came to roughly 135 working days, days that ran long from dawn to dusk, but days that were punctuated throughout by meal breaks, a proper midday rest, and the kind of unhurried pace that a modern project manager would find genuinely maddening. By contrast, the average American worker in the year Shaw was writing put in nearly 2,000 hours annually. Now, before we romanticize this too much, and I think it is worth pausing here to make sure we do not, those 135 days of labour could absolutely break a body. Ploughing frozen fields in January with an ox that keeps stopping, harvesting grain by hand in August heat, hauling timber, digging drainage ditches. This was not gentle countryside living. It was physically brutal in ways that are genuinely hard to imagine from the remove of modern life. But here is the thing, the rhythm of it was different, and rhythm, it turns out, matters enormously. A bishop of Durham named James Pilkington wrote a complaint in the 1500s that I find both historically illuminating and quietly hilarious in the way that only period documents can be. He was writing about the labouring men of his time, and he was not complimentary. "The labouring man," he wrote, "will take his rest long in the morning. A good piece of the day is spent before he comes to his work. Then he must have his breakfast, though he has not earned it at his accustomed hour. When the clock strikes, he will cast down his burden in the midway, and whatsoever he is in hand with, he will leave it as it is. At noon he must have his sleeping time, then his refreshment in the afternoon, which spends a great part of the day, and when his hour comes at night at the first stroke of the clock he casts down his tools, leaves his work in what need or case soever." What strikes me every time I read that passage is how perfectly it could have been written by a frustrated employer in the 21st century. The slow start to the morning, the mandatory breakfast break, the midday nap, the afternoon snack, the precise and unapologetic stopping at quitting time regardless of where the work stands. Bishop Pilkington found all of this outrageous. I find it rather admirable. The medieval peasant had not yet internalized the idea that his worth as a human being was measured by his productivity. When the work was done or when the light faded, which amounted to the same thing, the day was over. The boundary was real. The clock governed the end of work, not the demands of an overseer who happened to need one more thing done. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and where the gap between rich and poor cuts deeper than simple hours worked. Because what Bishop Pilkington's complaint does not mention, what the formal labour accounts never capture, is the invisible work that filled every hour outside those recorded fields. For a peasant woman especially, the working day had no boundary at all. While her husband ploughed and planted and stopped for his midday sleep, she was cooking over an open fire, spinning wool by hand into thread, weaving that thread on a loom, brewing ale, preserving food for winter, caring for children, tending the kitchen garden, feeding chickens, and doing all the 100 small tasks that kept a household alive. None of that work appeared in any wage record. None of it stopped at the first stroke of the clock. It simply continued until she fell asleep and began again before dawn. The historian Judith Bennett, who spent decades studying women's work in medieval England, estimated that women in peasant households worked longer total hours than their husbands, when all forms of labour field household childcare were counted together. The official records made them invisible. The reality was anything but. Now let us turn to the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the weavers, the cobblers, the candle makers, because their experience of work was entirely different from both the peasant in the field and the nobleman in the hall, and it is one of the most interesting stories in all of this period. By the 1500s, the guild system had been operating in European cities for roughly 400 years. Guilds were in essence professional associations with genuine power they regulated, who could practice a trade, what quality standards had to be met, what prices could be charged, and how apprentices were trained. In a major city like London or Paris or Florence, there might be 100 different guilds operating simultaneously, everything from goldsmiths to candle makers, from surgeons to saddlers. The path through a craft guild followed a three-stage progression that has shaped professional life in the Western world ever since. You entered as an apprentice, typically around the age of 12 or 13. For approximately 7 years, that was the standard term, though it varied. You lived in your master's household, worked for him without wages, and received in exchange your food, your lodging, your clothing, and an education in a trade. The master's interest in extending this arrangement was obvious free-skilled labour. The temptation to drag out the apprenticeship as long as possible was real enough that guilds had to set maximum terms to prevent abuse. After the apprenticeship, you became a journeyman. The word itself comes from the French journey, meaning a day. A journeyman was someone who worked by the day, travelling from master to master, selling daily labour. This was a period of building skill, saving money, and watching for an opportunity. A journeyman who could produce what the guild called a masterpiece, a single work of exceptional quality that demonstrated complete command of the trade, and who had enough money and social connections could apply to become a master. Only masters could own their own workshops. Only masters could train apprentices. Only masters in the true sense had arrived. Think about how long that road actually was. If you entered as an apprentice at 12, worked 7 years, spent perhaps another 5 or 10 as a journeyman, you might not become a master craftsman until your late 20s or early 30s, assuming you ever made it at all. Many journeymen never did. The guild's requirement for both a masterpiece and a substantial fee meant that skill alone was not enough. You also needed money, which meant the guild system, for all its protections, reproduced the advantages of those who already had some capital over those who had none. And what of the wealthy, the nobility, the great lords, the men and women at the top of the hierarchy that everyone else was labouring to support? Here is something that surprises people. The nobility were not idle, not exactly. A lord of a significant estate in 1500 had what amounted to a full-time administrative position. He had tenants to manage rents, to collect disputes, to arbitrate accounts, to review correspondence, to conduct and obligations to his own overlord to fulfill. His steward handled much of the day-to-day detail, but the lord himself was expected to be present, engaged, and occasionally feared. Legal records from the period show lords attending manorial courts, negotiating leases, reviewing harvest tallies. This was not nothing. But this is the crucial distinction: none of that labour was physical. None of it involved standing in a field for 10 hours, or spending a day at a forge, or carrying loads upstairs. The nobleman's work was the work of decision-making, of social performance, of maintaining position and authority within a hierarchy that would grind him out of it the moment he appeared weak or inattentive. And when the administrative work was done, often by mid-morning, once the steward had been briefed, the rest of the day was genuinely his to fill as he chose. Hunting was the great occupation of the nobility, and it was far more than recreation. It was a legal marker of status in England, as in most European countries it was strictly prohibited by law for commoners to hunt game. The forests and deer parks were explicitly reserved for the aristocracy. A peasant caught taking a deer from the lord's forest faced punishment that could range from heavy fines to imprisonment to, in earlier periods, mutilation. The right to hunt was not just a pleasure. It was a declaration of who you were. Beyond hunting, there were tournaments, falconry, chess, music, feasting, and the endless social performance of court life, all of it designed not merely to pass the time, but to demonstrate continuously and publicly that you were someone who could afford to not be working with your hands. And that, I think, is the deepest truth about work in 1500 that we've been circling around this whole time. Work was not a neutral activity in this world. It was a statement about your place in the universe. When a nobleman went hunting, he was not just enjoying himself, He was performing his social identity, the identity of someone whose labour had transcended the physical. When a peasant swung a scythe, he was not just harvesting grain. He was, in the eyes of the entire social order, confirming his position at the bottom of a divinely ordained hierarchy. When a journeyman craftsman spent years producing small parts of other people's larger projects, waiting for the day he could call himself a master, he was navigating a system that promised social elevation through skill, but delivered it only to those who also had the financial means to claim it. What I find remarkable about all of this, genuinely remarkable, not just academically interesting, is how much of this invisible architecture still exists. The idea that physical labour is less dignified than intellectual work. The idea that the measure of success is eventually not having to do the work yourself. The idea that your value is somehow connected to how much of your time you have managed to reclaim from necessity. These are not modern ideas, they are old ones, older than we usually remember. Of course, all of that work, whether you were a peasant in a field, a journeyman in a workshop, or a lord in a manor hall, existed within the context of the other great human institutions, and perhaps none shaped life in 1500 more completely than marriage, family, and the web of obligations and affections that bound people together. Who you married, why you married, when you married, and whether any of it had anything to do with love was one of the places where the difference between rich and poor in this world became most personal, most surprising, and honestly, most human. Here is a question I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. If you had been born in 1500 Europe, and someone had told you that the greatest romantic freedom, the greatest chance to actually choose who you spent your life with, existed among the poorest families, not the richest, what would your reaction be? Because that is exactly what the historical record shows, and it is one of those reversals of expectation that, once you sit with it, completely reframes how we understand power and privilege in this period. In 1500, marriage was the central organizing event of an adult life. For women especially, it defined almost everything: where you would live, how you would be fed, what your social position would be, whether your children would inherit anything, and what would happen to you if your husband died. Marriage was not a romantic decision so much as it was an economic, political, and sometimes diplomatic one. The question of who had a say in it, who had actual choice, splits along social lines in a way that most people today would find both surprising and deeply uncomfortable. Let us start at the highest level because the stories there are the most dramatic. In 1500, royal and high noble marriages were instruments of statecraft. They were treaties signed in human form. When a king's daughter was married off to a foreign prince, it was not celebrated primarily as a love match. It was celebrated as a peace agreement, a military alliance, or a territorial exchange dressed up in wedding clothes. Consider Margaret Tudor, the eldest daughter of King Henry VII of England. In 1502, England and Scotland concluded the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, ending 2 centuries of on-again, off-again warfare between the two kingdoms. And as part of the terms of that treaty, Margaret, who was 12 years old, was betrothed to James IV of Scotland, who was 28. 12 years old. Betrothed as a clause in a peace agreement. A proxy ceremony was held at Richmond Palace in January 1503 with another nobleman standing in for the king because the king himself did not bother to come. Margaret would not actually travel to Scotland to meet her husband until August of that year. She was 13 when she was formally married. Now I want to be careful not to impose 21st century frameworks entirely onto 1500. Margaret herself seems to have made a reasonable life of it. She and James had a relationship described by contemporary observers as genuinely affectionate. But the point stands, she'd been assigned to this marriage the way a clause is assigned to a contract. Her consent in any meaningful modern sense was never really the question. And Margaret's situation was not unusual. It was standard. Move one level down from royalty to the broader noble class, and the dynamics remain essentially the same, though the stakes are calibrated to the size of the estate rather than the size of the kingdom. A noble daughter in 1500 was, to be blunt about it, one of the most valuable movable assets her family possessed. She carried potential access to her family's lands, bloodline, and alliances. Marrying her to the right family could secure borders, resolve debts, strengthen political connections, or elevate status. Marrying her badly, or allowing her to marry whom she chose, could scatter these advantages, or worse, hand them to a rival. The historian Lawrence Stone, in his landmark study of marriage in England between 1500 and 1800, described the primary purpose of aristocratic arranged marriage as preserving and expanding wealth and political power, with its effect on the woman's autonomy being, in his words, secondary, even incidental. Secondary, even incidental. I find that phrase bracing every time I read it because it describes not malice but indifference, which in some ways is more difficult to argue against. Dowry negotiations could take months or years. The sums involved were staggering. A Florentine bride of good family in the 15th century might bring a dowry equivalent to several years of her father's entire income. Families in Florence even established a public financial instrument, the Monte delle Dotti, essentially a dowry savings fund specifically to help parents accumulate the capital needed to marry their daughters into suitable matches. Once the financial terms were settled, the bride was, in the words of one Tudor legal document, transferred from her childhood home to her husband's house, along with her dowry goods. In some cases she had met him briefly during negotiations. In others she had not met him at all. There is a document from 1558, a father's will, in which the English nobleman Michael Wentworth decreed that his daughter's dowry would be substantially reduced if she married of her own fantastical brain, rather than according to the advice of his executors. The phrasing is so perfectly revealing. Following her own heart in marriage was legally and socially categorized as a kind of recklessness, a failure of good judgment. Now cross to the other side of that invisible line, down to the peasant village, and here is where things become genuinely surprising. Among people who owned nothing worth negotiating over marriage looks entirely different. Historical records from Tudor England consistently show that common people, the agricultural labourers, the craftsmen, the cottagers, married for reasons that we would recognise much more readily today. There was no property of substance to be transferred, no alliance of political consequence to be forged. What there was instead was mutual practical interest, and in many cases genuine personal affection developed through actual acquaintance. The average age of marriage for peasant and working women in England and Northern Europe in this period was between 22 and 25. For men it was around 26 or 27. These were not children being arranged into contracts. These were adults who had spent years in a village working alongside one another, attending the same festivals and market days and church services and choosing each other. Courtship among common people in 1500 involved what we would recognise as courtship long acquaintance, the giving of small gifts, ribbons, gloves, a pair of good leather shoes, walking together to the well or the market. A couple who wished to marry would exchange a ring or some small object as a pledge, and this informal exchange, witnessed by their community, was in many regions considered legally binding even before any church ceremony took place. Legal records from the period show couples getting married, on the road, at the inn, at a friend's house, or even in bed, a casualness that would have been unthinkable in a noble household negotiating dynastic alliances, What is moving to me about this is how straightforwardly human it looks. A young man and woman who liked each other, who believed they could build something together, making a decision about their own lives. But I want to complicate this picture because the freedom of the poor in marriage had its own very hard edges. Choosing your partner freely does not mean that the marriage itself was easy. It does not mean that there was equality within it. In 1500, once a woman of any social class was married, she ceased to have independent legal existence in most of Europe. The English legal concept of coverture held that a married woman's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. Any property she brought into the marriage became his. And if the marriage was unhappy, if a woman found herself bound to a man who was cruel or neglectful or simply incompatible, her options were almost non-existent. The Church held marriage to be a sacrament and therefore indissoluble. Annulment was theoretically possible, but required grounds that were difficult to prove, expensive to pursue, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of ecclesiastical authorities. Divorce as we understand it did not exist. Historian Barbara Harris, writing about marriage in early Tudor England, noted that daughters were far more vulnerable than sons to pressure to consent to matches they disliked, because their entire financial future depended on the dowry their families controlled. You could refuse technically, but the consequences of refusing were severe reduced dowry, social censure, complete financial dependence on a family that had already decided what was best for you. This is why when I read about 1,500 marriages, I find myself drawn not to the dramatic royal alliances, but to the quieter moments of ordinary people navigating the limits of what was possible. The young woman who chose her husband at the village market and had something genuine with him, even if the law gave her almost no protections once the ring was on. The young nobleman's son who genuinely loved the woman his father had arranged for him, who learned to make something real out of a contract. Human beings have always been remarkably good at finding warmth inside cold structures. There is one final dimension of family life in 1500 that I think deserves a moment because it connects everything we've been discussing back to the most basic human experience: having children. For a peasant family, a child was from a very early age a contributing member of the household. By age 6 or 7, a child was fetching water, feeding animals, gathering wood. By 12, a child was working alongside adults in most of the major labour of the farm. There was love in these families. Do not misunderstand me. But children existed also as economic actors, as practical labour, as the closest thing a poor family had to a pension plan for old age. For a noble family, a child, particularly a firstborn son, was something different, the vessel of the lineage. He would inherit everything. He was trained from infancy not toward labour, but toward the performance of nobility-riding weapons, the management of lands and people, courtly manners. A second or third son might be sent to the church. A daughter was prepared from her earliest years for the negotiated marriage that would eventually deliver her into another household, and for the truly powerful even death was handled differently. A noble family had tombs, effigies, heraldic monuments. Their names endured in stone and in the records of their estates, their marriages, their alliances. A peasant's name often passed from the world entirely with the generation that carried it, recorded nowhere except perhaps in a parish baptism register, and even that only if the parish kept good records. This is what strikes me sitting with all of this. The gulf between rich and poor in 1500 was not just in what people had, it was in whether they left any trace of having existed at all. We've now moved through the external architecture of life in 1500 rank food housing, clothing, health, labour and love. but there is still a world we've not entered, one that shaped how all of these people understood their own existence. Because alongside the material divide, there was an inner divide, the world of childhood, of play, of learning, of whether a child grew up with any sense that the future might be different from the past. That is where we go next. And some of what you will find there may be the most unexpected thing in this entire series. Somewhere in the mud banks of the River Thames, archaeologists have been pulling up children's toys for decades. Tiny clay figures, miniature cups and plates small enough to fit in a child's palm. A lead alloy knight on horseback cast from a mould manufactured in the year 1300 to be sold in the markets of London not to collectors but to children, to be played with and broken and loved and lost just as children's things are today. There is something about these objects that stops me every time I think about them, because they are proof of something we tend to forget when we imagine the past, that the children of 1500 were not miniature adults who had skipped childhood to go straight into hardship. They were children. They played. They were loved. And somebody somewhere took the time to make them a toy knight. But what childhood actually looked like, how long it lasted, what it contained, and what it was preparing you for depended enormously on which side of the social line you'd been born onto. Tonight, we are going back to the beginning. We are starting with the smallest people in 1500 Europe and asking what their world looked like. Let us start with a concept that medieval thinkers had, which I find quietly fascinating: the ages of man. Scholars in 1500 inherited from the classical world the idea that human life moved through distinct stages. Infancy lasted until the age of 7, a period of growth and vulnerability. Then came childhood from 7 to 14, a period of play and learning. Then adolescence from 14 onward, when the body and mind arrived at something close to adult capacity. This framework actually gave children something that surprises many people. It gave them protected time. The medieval and Renaissance world was not entirely the grim child labour landscape that we sometimes imagine. There is genuine evidence in manuscripts, in coroners' records, in archaeological finds, in the writings of scholars, that people in 1500 cared deeply about children's well-being, mourned their deaths, worried about their development, and went out of their way to provide them with play and toys and time to be young. The humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, writing in 1529 in his essay on the education of boys, put it in terms that still ring true. Consider how dear a possession your son is. What a readiness is in all children's wits to learn what agility is in the mind of man, how easily those things be learned which are best and agreeable to nature, especially if they be taught of learned and gentle masters by the way of play. By the way of play, in 1529. Erasmus was arguing for gentle play-based learning 4.5 centuries before modern educational psychology caught up with him. But here is where the story splits completely depending on where you were born. For children of the peasant class, the protected years were real, but they were very short. Up to the age of about 7, a peasant child lived close to their mother, was fed and kept warm, and allowed to play in the ways that small children play everywhere, chasing, climbing, rolling objects down hills, inventing games from whatever was at hand. Dolls made from scraps of cloth or twisted reeds, spinning tops carved from wood, balls stuffed with rags. The children in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, where medieval illustrators sometimes let their wit loose on the borders of sacred texts, can be seen playing war on hobby horses, blowing whistles, wrestling in the dust. The same games, the same energy, the same basic humanity. Then 7 arrived. At 7, a peasant child began contributing to the family's survival in earnest. Not in the crushing way of the industrial age that would come 2 centuries later, with its coal mines and 12-hour factory shifts, but in the way of an agricultural household that simply needed every capable body. Fetching water, gathering firewood, feeding chickens and pigs, scaring birds away from the ripening grain, a job given specifically to children who could run back and forth across a field shouting and waving their arms all day with more energy than an adult. By 10 or 11, the work had expanded to include real agricultural labour, helping in the fields during planting and harvest learning, the rhythms of the land that would define the rest of their lives. By 12 or 13, a child was functionally an adult in terms of the work they were expected to do. The education that a peasant child received was almost entirely oral and practical. Some, perhaps more than we used to assume, learned to read and write at the parish church, where priests sometimes offered basic instruction. Martin Luther in the 1520s made a passionate argument for universal literacy precisely because he had seen firsthand how few common people could read at all, and he believed that access to scripture required the ability to read it yourself. But for most peasant children, literacy was not the education. The education was watching and doing how to plough a furrow straight, how to judge when grain was ripe, how to keep animals healthy through winter, how to brew, how to spin, how to build and mend. It was profound knowledge, it was hard won. But it was knowledge that pointed directly back to the life you had been born into and nowhere else. Now step across to a noble household and the concept of childhood looks entirely different. Noble children also had their early years of protection, play and care. Perhaps more so in some ways they were more likely to have dedicated nurses, more likely to have a nursery separate from adult space, more likely to have manufactured toys of the kind that survive in the archaeological record, beautifully carved wooden horses painted in bright colours, elaborate dolls dressed in miniature versions of fashionable adult clothing. But when 7 arrived for a noble boy, something happened that had no equivalent in any peasant household he left. The practice was called fostering out, and it was one of the most distinctive features of noble upbringing in this period. A boy of good family, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, almost never older than 12, would be sent to live in the household of another noble family of equal or higher status. There he would serve as a page running errands, attending at table, learning to handle horses and hawks, practicing with wooden swords under the supervision of experienced knights. This seems on the surface almost cruel. A child sent away from his parents before he had grown into himself to serve in a stranger's household. But the logic was specific and deliberate. A boy could not learn to be a nobleman by staying at home among people who loved him too indulgently. He needed to learn discipline, deference, and the complex social codes of noble life from people who had no particular reason to be gentle with him. And interwoven with this physical training was something the peasant child would likely never access formal education: Latin. Reading and writing in the vernacular, the rudiments of law and philosophy, music, the code of chivalry, which was as much a manual of social conduct as it was a set of martial values. Roger Ascham, the tutor who taught the future Queen Elizabeth I beginning when she was roughly 14 years old, wrote in his book The Schoolmaster, published in 1570, that the purpose of education was not merely to fill a child's head with knowledge, but to form their character. Elizabeth, by his account, could by age 11 read and converse fluently in Greek, Latin, Italian and French, fluently in 4 languages at 11. Now Elizabeth was exceptional by any measure in any century, but she was also the product of a system that threw enormous resources at a child's intellectual development from the very earliest years. Her half-sister Mary had been assigned the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives to design an entire curriculum for her when Mary was 7, a custom-designed education for a 7-year-old. The contrast with the peasant child learning to chase birds from a grain field is almost too large to put into words, And here is the piece of this that I keep turning over in my mind because I think it is the deepest and most durable part of the divide. The peasant child was educated for a life that was already determined. The knowledge they accumulated, and it was real knowledge, hard knowledge that kept people alive through hard winters, pointed entirely backwards toward the life their parents had lived and their grandparents before that. The horizon of possibility was essentially fixed at birth. The noble child the boy sent to another household to be trained in Latin and rhetoric and horsemanship, the girl educated by humanist tutors in languages and philosophy, was being prepared for a future that could, in theory, be different from the past. Not radically different in most cases, but different. A nobleman's son might rise at court, might travel, might accumulate influence in ways his father had not. A nobleman's daughter educated broadly might manage vast estates in her husband's absence, with a competence that illiterate women could never replicate. Education in 1500 was not primarily about knowledge. It was about the possibility of becoming, and the profound unfairness of the period is that this possibility was apportioned almost entirely by birth. There is a line from Erasmus that I want to leave you with because I think it might be the most radical thing any intellectual of his era put on the page. In his writings on education he argued, and this was genuinely controversial at the time, that the difference between a learned and an ignorant man was not a matter of innate capacity. It was a matter of what they had been given. He wrote in essence that virtually any child given the right teaching at the right age could reach heights that we would attribute to gifts of birth or nature. He was arguing in 1529 that intelligence and potential were distributed broadly across humanity, and that what looked like the natural hierarchy of smart and not smart, capable and incapable, was largely a hierarchy of opportunity. It took the world another 500 years to really begin taking that seriously. We have now travelled through almost all of the visible layers of life in 1500, the rank system that defined everything, the food and the roof and the clothes, health and labour love and family childhood, and the worlds it prepared you for. But there is one more dimension we have not yet touched. Something that shaped how all of these people, rich and poor, noble and common, made sense of everything. The institution that stood at the centre of European life in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine from where we sit now. The Church. Not as an abstract idea, but as a daily presence, as the place where your child was named and where you would eventually be buried, as the calendar that structured your year, the authority that governed your most intimate decisions, and the consolation that waited for you at the end of a life that, as we have seen, could be very hard indeed. That is where we go next. Before we go any further, I want you to try something. Imagine that every significant event of your life, being born, getting married, having children, burying your parents, and finally being buried yourself, required a payment. Not to the government, not to a hospital, but to the institution that also controlled whether or not your soul went to heaven. And imagine that the size of that payment determined, at least in the theology, most people believed completely the quality of what happened to you after death, that a wealthy person could quite literally purchase a shorter time in purgatory, and that a poor person scraping together coins to pay for a child's baptism while simultaneously owing 1/10 of their annual harvest to that same institution, genuinely had less access to God's mercy than someone with a full purse. That was not a metaphor in 1500. That was the operating system of daily life. The Catholic Church in 1500 was not simply a place you went on Sundays. It was the framework inside which all of existence made sense. Think about what the Church actually controlled. It administered the 7 sacraments that marked every stage of life: baptism at birth, confirmation in childhood, the Eucharist received at Mass penance through confession, marriage, holy orders for those entering the clergy, and last rites at death. To exist outside these sacraments was not just socially unusual, it was in the theology of the time to exist outside the possibility of salvation entirely. An unbaptized child, according to official church teaching, could not enter heaven. So the fee for baptism was not optional. It was the price of your child's eternal soul. A marriage not solemnized by the church was not legitimate. So the fee for a church wedding was not optional either. A burial in unconsecrated ground meant exclusion from the community of the saved. So the fee to be buried in holy ground was again not optional. And layered on top of all of these required payments was the tithe, a tenth of your annual income paid to the church. Not suggested, required. And not just in money for a peasant who might never handle significant cash. The tithe could be paid in grain, in livestock, in labour. A tenth of what you had grown with your hands extracted before you could feed your family through winter. On top of the tithe, you were expected to give at collections during Mass. On top of that, you were expected to work church land for a specified number of days per year, days when you were not working your own land, growing your own food. I want to pause here and just acknowledge something. No institution in the modern world operates with this degree of financial extraction from its members. We do not have an equivalent reference point. The closest thing might be imagining a government that taxed you 10% of your income required payment for every legal document you ever needed and also ran the afterlife. Now here is where the rich and poor diverge in a way that is genuinely stunning to contemplate. The church had developed by 1500 a sophisticated theological product that could convert earthly wealth directly into spiritual advantage. It was called an indulgence. The formal theological foundation was this: the church maintained that it held a treasury of merits, a vast accumulated store of spiritual credit built up by Christ and the saints far beyond what any of them had needed for their own salvation. The church, as Christ's representative on earth, could draw from this treasury and apply it to the spiritual debts of ordinary sinners. In practice, by 1500, this meant you could purchase a document pre-signed by the Pope, sold by travelling agents called pardoners, that would remit the temporal punishment for your sins, either your own sins or the sins of a deceased relative still suffering in purgatory. The price varied by sin and by the seller's judgment of what the market would bear. But the essential logic was unmistakable wealth could purchase spiritual redemption in a way that poverty could not. Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope elected in 1513, who commissioned Raphael to decorate the Vatican and kept a court of 700 servants, was funding the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, partly through an aggressive indulgence-selling campaign. The Dominican friar Johann Tetzel was touring German cities in 1517 with a phrase that became notorious: "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings a soul from purgatory springs." That phrase, cynical, transactional, audacious, captured exactly what was happening. Heaven had become, at least in practice, partially available for purchase, and its price was beyond the reach of most of the people who were simultaneously required to fund the institution selling it. This is what drove Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and university professor in Wittenberg, to write his 95 Theses in October of 1517 and post them on the castle church door. He was not primarily attacking the church's wealth or its power or its political entanglements. He was attacking the idea that a coin could accomplish what only faith could accomplish, that God's mercy was purchasable, that the poor farmer who could not afford an indulgence was less protected from damnation than the merchant who could. The Reformation, that earthquake that split Christianity in two and reshaped the entire political landscape of Europe, began as an argument about fairness in the spiritual economy of heaven. But I want to resist the temptation to leave you with a picture of pure cynicism, because I think that would actually misrepresent what religion meant to most ordinary people in 1500. For the vast majority, the peasants, the craftsmen, the women grinding grain before dawn, the church was not primarily experienced as a financial extraction scheme. It was experienced as the place where the incomprehensible parts of life were given meaning. The church calendar structured the entire year into a rhythm of sacred time. Christmas and Easter were not merely religious observances, they were the largest social events most people would experience opportunities for community, for feasting, for the suspension of ordinary labour, for beauty that otherwise barely touched a peasant's life. The church building itself, often the only stone structure in a village, was the tallest, most elaborate, most decorated space that most common people would ever enter. Its painted walls told the stories of Scripture in images accessible to people who could not read. Its music, the choir, the organ, the bells, was the most sophisticated sound most of them would ever hear. When a child died, and as we saw earlier, roughly 1 in 3 did not reach adulthood, the parish church was where you brought your grief, where the community gathered around you, where the priest performed the rituals that gave the loss a shape within a larger story of redemption and eternity. I do not think we can understand 1500 without feeling the weight of how much people needed that. For the nobility, the church was something simultaneously more and less. More in that noble families had private chaplains, private chapels, endowed chantries, where masses were said perpetually for the souls of their ancestors. A wealthy merchant or nobleman could pay for an entire chantry, essentially a small chapel within a church with a priest employed specifically to say daily masses for the donor's soul and the souls of their family members. The wealthy could in effect purchase perpetual spiritual maintenance for their lineage. It was the afterlife equivalent of buying a premium subscription. But the nobility also had something the poor did not: enough learning and enough distance from desperate necessity to sometimes view the church with the degree of critical detachment. It was largely among the educated and the comfortable that the humanist critics of church corruption first found their audience. Erasmus, who we met in the last part as an advocate for gentle education, was also the most incisive satirist of church abuses in his era, writing in praise of folly that the church had become fat on the credulity of the faithful and the fears of the dying. He wrote it in Latin, for an audience of educated nobles and scholars. The peasants who bore the heaviest financial burden of the church's practices could not read it. There is something deeply ironic about that, the people who suffered most from a system being the last to hear it critiqued. What strikes me when I sit with all of this is the way the spiritual and the material were absolutely inseparable in 1500, in a way that is very hard to feel from where we sit now. We live in a world where at least formally the state of your soul and the size of your bank account are kept separate, where religious practice is in principle available to everyone equally, where the experience of the sacred is not priced differently based on what you can pay. That separation is genuinely new. It is in historical terms very recent, and it was purchased, if that is the right word, at enormous cost through the fractures of the Reformation and the religious conflicts that followed it, through slow changes in how church and state related to one another, through the long and difficult argument that God's mercy, if it exists at all, does not have a sliding scale. The poor farmer of 1500 pressing his last coins into the parish collection box while the pardoner moved through the next village, selling certificates of heavenly grace to anyone who could afford them, he did not know that the world was about to change. He did not know that a monk in Wittenberg was about to make an argument in 48 hours that would reorder the spiritual architecture of the entire continent. He just knew what he knew, that God was watching, that death was close, and that the church was the only door he had. We have now walked through nearly all of the chapters of life in 1500. Birth and childhood, work and marriage, health and faith, the texture of daily existence on both sides of the Great Divide. But there is one last question that I have been holding back, saving for the end, because I think it is the most important question of all. What does it mean? What can we take from all of this? All of this distance, all of this inequality, all of this suffering and resilience and beauty, and bring back with us into the world we actually live in. That is exactly what we're going to explore in the final chapters of this journey. Something happened at least once a year in almost every village in 1500 Europe that I want you to picture clearly, because I think it captures something essential about human nature that transcends every difference we have discussed so far. The harvest was in, the heavy work was done, the grain was stored, and for a few days, sometimes a week, sometimes more, the village gathered together, built a fire in the open air, and did something that required no money, no permission, and no social rank to participate in. They danced. Not the carefully choreographed court dancing of the nobility, with its formal steps and elaborate protocols about who bowed to whom, but the kind of dancing that starts when a fiddle begins playing and your body just goes, where someone who has been bent over a field for 3 months stands up straight for the first time and moves, and the music and the company and the release of it all does something that no other experience in that hard life quite replicates. I want to spend some time tonight in the entertainment of 1500 because I think it is one of the most revealing lenses we have for understanding what people actually valued, what they craved, and in a way I find genuinely surprising where some of the richest human experience of that period was found. Let us be direct about the obvious difference. First, the nobility had more leisure, more resources, and more consistent access to professional entertainment than anyone else. We've touched on this before, but let us look at what it actually looked like. A great noble household in 1500 maintained what was essentially a permanent entertainment program. A lord of any standing kept household musicians, typically a small ensemble of lutanists, a viol player or two, perhaps a singer whose job was to provide music at meals during relaxation and at any occasion that called for it. The lute, the most fashionable instrument of the Renaissance, was so central to aristocratic life that being unable to play it was considered a social deficiency, the way not knowing how to dance might be considered today. Noble courts also employed jesters, professional comedians, whose job was to make the lord laugh often through a combination of wit, wordplay, physical comedy, and the kind of barbed honesty that no one else in the court could safely deliver. The jester was in many noble households the only person permitted to mock the lord to his face. It was a peculiar and fascinating social role, the fool who was actually the wisest man in the room. For larger entertainments, nobles commissioned what were called masques, elaborate theatrical productions combining music, dance, poetry, and spectacle, often organized around an allegorical story that flattered the host. The costumes were extraordinary, the staging intricate, the cost enormous. Cardinal Wolsey famously spent the equivalent of many years' income on a single evening's entertainment at Hampton Court in 1527, hosting King Henry VIII, with a banquet and masque that contemporaries described as beyond anything previously seen in England. And in the Italian courts, Florence, Mantua, Ferrara, the Renaissance was giving birth to entirely new art forms. By the late 1500s, the first operas were being developed in Florence's intellectual salons, composed by men like Jacopo Peri and Giulio Caccini, performed for audiences of learned nobles and scholars who believed they were reconstructing the musical theatre of ancient Greece. The very first opera, Peri's Daphne, was performed around 1598 for a private gathering of perhaps 50 people. Private for 50 people. The most revolutionary musical development in Western history debuted in a room the size of a large living room. But here is what I find genuinely fascinating when I dig into the entertainment of the poor and why I think the story of leisure in 1500 is not simply the rich had more fun. The entertainment of common people in this period was in many ways more communal, more participatory and more emotionally intense than anything the wealthy were experiencing behind their castle walls. Consider the mystery plays. These were large-scale theatrical productions performed outdoors in town squares and marketplaces, often organised by the craft guilds of a city. They dramatised stories from the Bible, the fall of Adam and Eve, Noah, and the flood, the birth of Christ, the crucifixion with full costumes, music, special effects created by ingenious stagecraft and casts of dozens. The city of York in England performed a cycle of 48 mystery plays that took an entire day to complete. Chester and Coventry had their own cycles. These were not small parish performances, they were the largest theatrical events in English life, drawing audiences from across the region. And the audience did not sit quietly and watch. They moved through the town, following the action from one elaborate stage wagon to the next. They called out. They laughed, they wept. An account from the 1400s describes audience members weeping openly at the crucifixion scenes and then roaring with laughter at the comic portrayal of the devil. This was free entertainment, or close enough to free that the price of admission was not the barrier. Everyone came, the lord and the peasant, the merchant and the beggar, standing in the same open air, watching the same story unfold. Then there were the village festivals which followed the church calendar, with a regularity that gave ordinary life a rhythm of anticipation. May Day brought the entire village to the green to dance around the maypole and crown the Queen of May, a young woman chosen for her beauty, or her family's standing garlanded with spring flowers, presiding over a day of games and music, and deliberately suspended ordinary life. Midsummer's Eve brought bonfires. Christmas brought 13 days of celebration from the 25th of December through the 6th of January. And running through all of these festivals was music not performed at people, but performed by people. The village tavern was a centre of musical life. Almost any gathering of more than a few people involved singing. The songs were ballads, folk tunes, drinking rounds, and comic songs of a ribaldry that the church periodically tried and spectacularly failed to suppress. Music in 1500 was not a passive experience you paid to receive. It was something you did collectively with your body and your voice in a room full of people you knew. Do you ever think about how rarely we make music together now? How most modern people go through entire years listening to music but almost never making it alongside other people in the same room? I find something quietly melancholy about that comparison. There is one more category of popular entertainment in 1500 that I cannot leave out because it tells us something uncomfortable and true about human nature. The blood sports. Bear baiting was exactly what it sounds like. A bear chained to a post in a circular arena set upon by a pack of trained dogs. The bear tried to defend itself. The dogs tried to hold on. The crowd bet on the outcome. Bear baiting arenas round open air with tiered seating around a central pit existed across England and the continent, and they drew audiences from all social classes. Queen Elizabeth I herself attended bear baitings on numerous occasions. The same structure that housed bear baitings would within a generation house a different kind of drama. The Globe Theatre itself was built in the same tradition of the circular baiting arena. Bull baiting, cockfighting, staged wrestling, public punishments that drew crowds. I am not going to pretend these things were not part of the entertainment landscape of 1500. They were enormously popular, and what I find interesting about them, rather than simply condemning them from our vantage point, is what they reveal about people who lived in a world with very limited ways of processing intensity emotion and the randomness of violence. People who had watched children die of fever and neighbours hauled away for debt and livestock slaughtered with their own hands. The violence in the pit was not entirely separate from the violence in their daily lives. It was in some ways a performance of what was already everywhere. We have our own spectacles, our own arenas. They are just more mediated. What stays with me when I think about all of this is a painting. Peter Bruegel the Elder, the great Flemish painter who spent his career documenting peasant life with a precision and affection that no other artist of his era matched, painted Peasant Wedding in 1568. It shows a barn full of people eating, drinking, laughing, passing dishes, and existing together in a way that radiates warmth across 5 centuries of distance. These are people who worked brutally hard, who had almost nothing by any modern measure, who faced illness and early death as daily companions. And they look so thoroughly alive. What Bruegel understood, and what I think the history of entertainment in 1500 ultimately shows us, is that human beings do not wait for comfort or security before they find joy. They find it in the middle of everything else, in the fiddle starting up after harvest, in the baby being passed around the wedding table, in the crowd at the mystery play weeping and laughing in the same hour. The joy was not despite the hardship. It was woven into the same fabric. We have now travelled through nearly every corner of life in 1500. From the rank that determined your world at birth to the entertainment that briefly made all of that rank irrelevant. What remains is the question I promised you we would ask, the final accounting. What, if anything, can all of this history, all of this distance, all of this suffering, all of this unexpected joy actually tell us about where we stand right now? Because I believe it can tell us quite a lot. And some of what it tells us I think you will find genuinely unexpected. That is where we are going next. At some point in the 1400s, a wealthy Florentine merchant named Francesco d'Attini, a man so obsessed with record-keeping that historians have found more than 150,000 of his letters and business documents preserved in an archive in Prato, received a piece of urgent news from his agent in Venice. It had travelled roughly 170 miles. It arrived in 4 days. To Francesco, this was entirely normal. He ran a network of couriers connecting Florence, Venice, Bruges, London and Barcelona. A letter from Barcelona could reach him in 18 days, from London in less than 30. He knew what wool was selling for in Flanders on approximately the same week he was making purchasing decisions in Tuscany. He knew which roads were safe, which passes were blocked by snow, which ports were under watch by rival merchants. His commercial empire rested not on muscle or land, but on information, the speed at which it reached him, and the accuracy with which it was acted upon. Now I want you to hold that image for a moment, and then picture a peasant farmer in a village 20 miles from Florence in the same decade. He'd been born in that village. His father had been born in that village. His grandfather's grandfather had been born in that village. His knowledge of the world beyond the nearest market town, which he might visit 4 or 5 times a year, came from the priest at Sunday Mass, from travellers passing through on rare occasions, and from the accumulated rumours that circulated through conversations at the well and the tavern. He did not know who was King of France. He may not have been entirely certain who the current Pope was. He almost certainly could not have told you where England was on a map, not because he was unintelligent, but because the very concept of a map was not part of his accessible world. The mental geography available to him extended perhaps 20-30 miles in any direction. Beyond that there was a kind of fog, not ignorance exactly, but a legitimate absence of information that no effort on his part could easily remedy. 2 human beings 20 miles apart living in 2 completely different epistemic worlds. Let us spend a moment with the mechanics of how information actually moved in 1500, because I think it is one of the most clarifying things we can understand about the gap between rich and poor in this period. The Italian merchant families Datini Medici, Bardi Strozzi had operated organized courier networks since the 1300s. By the late 1400s, these networks were sophisticated enough that Florentine merchants expected mail from Paris in 20 to 22 days and from London in under 30. This was not casual correspondence. These were business letters containing prices credit arrangements, political intelligence and assessments of risk. Information for these merchants was a commodity as valuable as silk or pepper, but the great leap forward in organized European communication came in 1495, when the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian I commissioned the Tasso family from Bergamo, later known as the Thurn and Taxis dynasty, to establish a formal imperial postal network. The concept was brilliantly simple relay stations placed every 20 to 30 kilometers along major routes where riders could change horses without stopping. A courier travelling the main route did not need to exhaust a single horse over hundreds of miles. He handed off the satchel at each station, and a fresh horse and fresh rider continued the journey. The result was stunning speed. By the early 1500s, a letter could travel from Brussels to Paris in 36 hours. The route from Vienna to Brussels, crossing mountain passes and multiple kingdoms, could be completed in about 5.5 days. This was not slow by any standard until the invention of the telegraph 3 centuries later. The Thurn and Taxis network eventually employed 20,000 mounted riders, covering more than 120,000 kilometers of routes, and it served almost exclusively rulers, diplomats, major merchants and nobles who could afford the fees. The postal relay was the internet of 1500, and most people in Europe had no connection to it whatsoever. Here is where I think the most important and least discussed gap between rich and poor in 1500 lies not in gold or food or comfort, but in something more fundamental. It lies in the size of the world each person was allowed to inhabit. For a noble or a wealthy merchant, the world was genuinely large. Charles V of the Habsburg dynasty, who became the most powerful monarch in Europe in 1519, ruled territories stretching from Spain and its American colonies to Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. His correspondence network spanned the globe. When Hernán Cortés was in Mexico, Charles received dispatches delayed but real about what was happening there. The world for the people at the top had become genuinely planetary within the first decades of the 1500s. For a French peasant in the Loire Valley in 1500, that same world was approximately the distance a person could walk in a day and return by nightfall. Historians who have studied medieval village records have found that many people who lived and died in the same parish had never travelled beyond a 10 or 15-mile radius from their birthplace. Not because travel was impossible, but because there was no reason to go, no means to go, and no information to guide the journey even if they had wanted to take it. The world was not equally large for everyone, and the size of the world you inhabited determined in profound ways the kinds of questions you were capable of asking. And then into this unequal landscape arrived the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg completed his first substantial printed book, the Gutenberg Bible, in 1455 or 1456 in Mainz. Every copy had been pre-sold before he finished setting the last page. Within 50 years of that first Bible rolling off the press, more than 1,000 print shops had been established in over 200 European cities and towns. By 1500, they had collectively produced somewhere between 9 and 10 million individual books. Let me give you a comparison that puts this in perspective. The largest library in Europe in 1300, the University Library of Paris, held 300 manuscripts. 300. By the 1490s, a printed copy of a great work by Cicero cost roughly a month's salary for a schoolteacher. What had been accessible only to the very wealthiest collectors had become within 2 generations a commodity available to any literate merchant, student, or professional. One historian of the period, Elizabeth Eisenstein, who spent much of her career studying the printing revolution, argued that the press's greatest gift to knowledge was not merely speed of transmission, but accuracy. Before printing, every book was a hand copy of a hand copy errors, multiplying silently through generations of transcription. A printed edition meant that every reader in Florence, Paris, and London was reading the exact same text with the exact same numbers, the exact same diagrams. Scientific progress, which depends on shared reliable data, became possible in a new way. Now, and this is crucial, the printing press initially changed very little for the peasant, who could not read, could not afford even a cheap pamphlet, and had no access to anyone who would read to them in a language they fully understood. The first great beneficiaries of print were exactly the people already connected to power: scholars, merchants, lawyers, nobles, and the clergy. Print first widened the gap before it narrowed it. But here is where it gets interesting. The printing press also produced something that did reach ordinary people: the broadside. A broadside was a single large sheet printed on one side containing a sensational story, a battle, a flood, a miracle, a royal scandal often illustrated with a woodcut image. Broadsides were cheap enough to pin to a tavern wall. They were read aloud to the illiterate by those who could read. Historians note that by the 1490s, people in English and German towns were beginning to gather at taverns to hear a paid reader recite the latest news. This radically changed the consumption of news, one historian wrote. It made it normal to go check the news every day. That sentence is worth sitting with. Going to check the news every day in 1490. Something we take completely for granted. The printing press did not democratize knowledge immediately or completely, but it did plant the seed of the idea that information was something a person had a right to want. There is one more story I want to tell you about the world of information in 1500, and it involves a man who in 1517 did something that would not have been possible without the printing press, and which changed the entire world. You already know his name, Martin Luther. But what we talked about in the last section was his theological argument. What I want to focus on now is the mechanics of how it spread. On October 31st, 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses, his list of criticisms of indulgence selling, on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The standard image is of a lone monk with a hammer and a list of complaints. The reality of what happened next was something neither Luther nor anyone else had ever seen before. Someone took that document, a reasonably short Latin text written for an academic debate, and set it on a printing press. Within 2 weeks it had been reprinted and was circulating in cities across Germany. Within a month it was being read across Europe. Luther himself wrote in some astonishment that his theses flew in a fortnight farther than I could have foreseen. He had written them for a local academic audience. The printing press turned them into a continent-wide conversation. The church had handled critics before. What it had not handled was a critic with access to mass reproduction. Every previous reformer, John Huss, whom we mentioned in Part 9, burned at the Council of Constance for heresy, had operated in a world where the church could contain the spread of dangerous ideas by controlling the manuscripts in which they appeared. With the printing press, that containment became impossible. You could not unprint an idea. You could not burn every copy fast enough. Information once released into the printed world moved according to a new set of rules that no authority fully controlled. Does any of this sound familiar? I've been thinking as I put this part of the series together about the obvious parallel. We are living through something structurally similar right now. A new information technology, the internet and social media, that has shattered the previous gatekeeping system for information. That has made it possible for ideas to travel at a speed that no institution can fully contain. That has democratized access to knowledge in profound ways, while simultaneously flooding us with misinformation propaganda and exactly the kind of broadside-style sensationalism that the printing press also produced in its first decades. The parallel is not perfect. The differences matter enormously. But when you read accounts of church authorities in 1518 trying frantically to suppress Luther's pamphlets, while printers across Germany kept reproducing them faster than censors could act, and then look at the news cycle of the last decade, there is a recognition there that I think is worth feeling. We're not the first people to discover that information once set free creates both liberation and chaos in equal measure. The people of 1500 learned that too. They just learned it more slowly than we did. The divide between rich and poor in 1500 was in the end also a divide between those who knew the world and those for whom the world remained largely unknowable. But that divide was about to crack. The printing press was already doing the slow work of making knowledge something that could not be permanently hoarded, something that however unevenly and imperfectly was beginning to spread, and that is exactly where we are going in our final chapter. Because after everything we have seen, the food, the clothing, the medicine, the marriage, the church, the play, the information, the question I keep returning to is what actually changed. What does the distance between 1500 and now mean? And are we as far from that world as we like to think? The final part of this journey is coming right up. I want to tell you about a number that genuinely stopped me in my tracks when I first encountered it, because it reframes everything we have talked about in this entire series. In 1500, specifically in the year 1524, the wealthiest 10% of English households controlled approximately 64% of all wealth in the country. The Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure of inequality running from 0 for perfect equality to 1 for perfect inequality, was approximately 0.76. That is a very high number. That is the kind of inequality we usually associate with the most extractive, stratified societies in history. Now here is the part that stopped me. In the year 2010, 510 years later, after the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of democracy, labour unions, public education, the welfare state, progressive taxation, and every single mechanism we have built to try to create a more equal society, the wealthiest 10% of households in the United Kingdom controlled approximately 54% of all wealth. The bottom 50% of the population in 1525 owned essentially nothing. The bottom 50% in 2010 owns approximately 8%. The distance between those two worlds is real. It is profound. It represents centuries of struggle and institutional change and the slow expansion of what we consider basic human rights. But the distance is also, and I say this with a strange mix of relief and unease, smaller than I expected it to be. Let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that nothing has changed. I'm not saying that the life of a person born into poverty today is equivalent to the life of a peasant farmer in 1500. The differences are enormous. A person on minimum wage in a developed country today has access to medical care that would have seemed like sorcery to even the wealthiest noble in 1500. They have literacy. They have the vote. They have legal personhood in ways that a serf did not. They have running water, electric light refrigeration, vaccines, painkillers, the internet, the ability to speak to someone on the other side of the planet instantly. The material conditions of life at the bottom have improved beyond what anyone in 1500 could have imagined. But what has not changed, or what has changed far less than I think most of us assume, is the structure of the hierarchy itself, the relative distance between the top and the bottom. The way that wealth and power concentrate, the mechanisms by which advantage reproduces itself across generations. When I look at the data on wealth inequality across 7 centuries of European history, compiled by the economic historian Guido Alfani and others, what emerges is a clear pattern. Inequality rose almost continuously from the mid-1400s through the early 1900s. The only significant interruption was the Black Death, which killed so many people that labour became scarce and wages rose. Within a century, the inequality had returned to its previous level and then continued climbing. It took the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War 3 catastrophic shocks in rapid succession to break that trend. Between 1914 and 1980, inequality fell dramatically across the developed world. The Gini coefficient in the United Kingdom dropped from around 0.6 to approximately 0.24 by the late 1970s. It was the most equal moment in recorded European history. And then, starting around 1980, it began climbing again. It has been climbing ever since. The graph of inequality over 7 centuries looks like a valley. The years from approximately 1940 to 1980 sit at the bottom of that valley. We're currently climbing back up the far side. I've been thinking a lot about why this matters, why it is worth spending 2.5 hours walking through the textures of daily life in 1500, the food, the housing, the medicine, the marriage, the entertainment, the information, if the conclusion is simply that things were unequal then, and they are unequal now. And I think the answer is this. The gap between rich and poor in 1500 was not natural. It was not inevitable. It was not the product of some immutable law of human nature or economics. It was the product of specific institutions, feudalism, primogeniture, sumptuary laws, the concentration of literacy and education, the monopolization of information, regressive taxation, the legal restriction of mobility institutions that were designed consciously or unconsciously to preserve the advantages of those who already had them. And when we look closely at those institutions, we see something uncomfortable. Many of them are still with us, not in the same form, not with the same intensity, but the basic mechanism, the way that wealth generates more wealth, the way that access to information or education or capital creates compounding advantages, the way that political power and economic power reinforce each other. Those mechanisms are not gone. They have simply become more subtle, more mediated, harder to see. A noble in 1500 did not need to justify their wealth. It was simply the order of things. God had ordained it. Aristotle had explained it. The natural hierarchy of men made it inevitable. We do not talk that way anymore. We have built an entire ideological apparatus around the idea that success is earned, that the playing field is level, that anyone can rise through merit and effort. And some of that is true. The barriers are lower. The ladders are more numerous. The distance between the bottom and the middle is crossable in ways it was not in 1500. But the distance between the middle and the top, the distance between comfortable and genuinely powerful, has remained stubbornly, almost perversely similar across 5 centuries. There is a historian named Walter Scheidel who wrote a book called The Great Leveller, in which he argues, based on analysis of inequality across millennia, that the only forces powerful enough to significantly reduce inequality are catastrophic mass mobilization, warfare, violent revolution, state collapse, or lethal pandemics. Everything else, he suggests, produces only marginal changes. Progressive taxation helps, labor unions help, public education helps, but they do not fundamentally alter the structure. They smooth the edges, they widen access to the middle, but the very top remains largely untouched. I do not know if Scheidel is right. I hope he is not. The implication is almost unbearably bleak. that the only path to a genuinely equal society runs through mass death and civilizational rupture. But I also think there is something clarifying about his argument, because it forces us to confront the possibility that the inequality we see around us is not a glitch in the system. It is not a temporary condition that will resolve itself through natural economic forces or incremental policy adjustments. It is the system. It is what power does when left to its own devices. It concentrates, it compounds, it builds walls to protect itself. And the only question that matters is, what are we willing to do about it? I want to end by bringing us back to the people we have spent this entire series getting to know. The peasant farmer waking before dawn to begin a day of labour that will not end until the light is gone. The noble woman managing a household of 50 servants while navigating the treacherous politics of court. The merchant calculating risks on a shipment that could bankrupt him or make his fortune. The child in the field scaring birds. The midwife delivering a baby by candlelight. The printer setting type for a pamphlet that might get him arrested. The musician playing at a wedding. The beggar at the church door. What I keep coming back to after everything is how intensely alive all of these people were, how much they wanted, how much they felt, how much they hoped and feared and loved and grieved. The structures they lived inside were profoundly unequal. The distance between the richest and the poorest was vast and unbridgeable, and enforced by law and custom and the threat of violence. But within those structures, people still found ways to live, to make meaning, to protect each other, to laugh at a festival, to pass down a song, to bury their dead with dignity, to raise their children with whatever hope they could muster that the future might be gentler than the past. They were not passively enduring, they were actively surviving. And in many cases, they were doing more than surviving. They were building the tiny incremental changes, a printing press here, a guild regulation there, a theological argument that spread like wildfire through the new networks of information that would eventually crack open the world they lived in and make something new possible. We are 500 years downstream from the people in this story. We've inherited the world they built, both its liberations and its constraints. The printing press became the internet. The merchant networks became global capital markets. The theological debates about indulgences became the secular arguments about fairness and merit and the role of the state. The mystery plays became cinema. The harvest festivals became long weekends. The profound uncertainty about whether your children would live to adulthood became for most of us in the developed world a statistical near certainty that they will. The material conditions have changed almost beyond recognition. But the question at the centre of it all, who gets to have enough and who decides, is the same question it was in 1500. And I think the most important thing we can take from this long walk through history is this: the answer to that question is not fixed. It is not inevitable. It is not written into the fabric of the universe. It is a choice that societies make over and over again through institutions and laws and norms and the stories they tell themselves about what is fair. In 1500, the answer was determined by birth, by the accident of where and to whom you were born, and that accident determined almost everything else: your food, your home, your health, your marriage, your education, your access to knowledge, your very sense of how large the world was allowed to be. We have changed that answer, not completely, not even mostly, but enough that the direction of travel is visible, enough that the idea of a different answer, a more equal answer, is thinkable in ways it was not for most of human history. And that in the end is what I want to leave you with. Not that things are perfect now, not that we have solved the problem of inequality, but that the problem is solvable, that the structures that create it are human structures, that what was built can be rebuilt, that what was chosen can be chosen differently. The people of 1500 did not know they were living at the beginning of a revolution. They did not know that the printing press in Mainz would change everything, that the monk in Wittenberg would crack open the church, that the ship sailing west would open a hemisphere, that the children playing in the mud banks of the Thames were the early subjects of an empire that would span the globe. They just lived. They made the choices available to them. They pushed at the edges of what was possible, and 500 years later we are still living inside the consequences of those choices, which means that the choices we make now about how we structure our economies, about who has access to education and healthcare, and opportunity about whether we treat inequality as a natural fact or as a political decision, those choices will echo just as far. The people 500 years from now will look back at us the way we're looking back at 1500. They will see things we cannot see. They will judge us by standards we have not yet imagined. I hope they see that we tried. I hope they see that we understood the size of the problem. I hope they see that we did not simply accept the world we inherited as the only world possible. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for sitting with the discomfort of the past and the questions it raises about the present. Thank you for caring enough about people you will never meet, both the people 500 years behind us and the people 500 years ahead, to spend this time thinking about what connects us all. If you found something valuable in this series, I would be grateful if you would share it. The algorithm rewards engagement, and every share helps these stories reach someone who might need to hear them. I will be back soon with another deep dive into a moment in history that has something urgent to tell us about who we are and where we are going. Until then, take care of each other. Question the structures you live inside. And remember that the world you were born into is not the only world possible. I will see you in the next one.